Welcome to the second of our 2 days of workshop reflections on reframing transgender violence. I'm Kendall Thomas, and I've organized the workshop in my capacity as a member of the working group of the Reframing Gendered Violence group and the Center for the Study of Social Difference here at Columbia. The Reframing Gendered Violence series, of which the Reframing Transgender Violence workshop is a part, was created with the support of former Columbia University Dean of Humanities Sharon Marcus, whom we'd like to thank, along with our sponsors, the Queer Theory Working Group at the Center for the Study of Social Difference, the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality, the Just Societies Initiative, the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law, and the Society of Fellows and the Heyman Center for the Humanities. I'd also like to extend a heartfelt thank you to four people: Liz Boylan of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law, Megan Chia of the Center for the Study of Law and Culture, and Catherine Lasota of the Center for the Study of Social Difference. We'd also like to thank the Center for the Study of Social Differences Program Coordinator, Aya Eldosogi, who's sitting right here. Without these folks, we would not be here this morning. And we very often, those of us who organize these conferences conceptually, um, do not adequately recognize or acknowledge the work that is involved in pulling together the material infrastructure for events like this. So I truly, truly am grateful for the work that these folks have done. We're going to have a very, very busy day today, but I know that everyone in the room has lots of stamina and that you're ready for a day of focused work. We began our reflections yesterday with an extraordinary panel um, and want to continue that discussion, which will no doubt pick up some of the themes that were so powerfully introduced during our opening session by staging a conversation among three lawyers, all of whom work in some capacity on the issues of transgender violence that are at the center of our deliberations today. And I'm going to introduce these folks in the order in which they will speak. Um, I want to begin by acknowledging our first speaker, Sergio Suiama, who has traveled to us from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where he works as a prosecutor in the Office of the Federal Prosecution Services. Sergio's brief includes responsibility for enforcing the law in matters of environmental and cultural heritage. He is also the federal ombudsman in the state and the current chairperson of the working group on sexual and reproductive rights of the federal ombudsman's office in Brasilia. As a federal prosecutor, and prior to his work as a public defender, Sergio has been an advocate um, in the area of civil, economic, social, and cultural rights for more than 24 years. As a prosecutor, he's currently in charge of bringing to the federal court litigation involving allegations of discrimination against LBGT folks, as well as to push federal administrative and private agents to acknowledge and to respect the rights of LGBT, Afro Brazilians, and other vulnerable groups in Brazil. Sergio is a former Columbia Human Rights Fellow and member of the LLM class of Columbia of 2010. Um, After Sergio, we will hear from Chinyere Ezie, who is a lawyer for the Center for Constitutional Rights here in New York. Chinyere's work involves advocacy around racial and gender justice, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex rights, and challenges to governmental abuses of power. Prior to joining the Center for Constitutional Rights, Chinyere was a staff attorney at the Southern Poverty Law Center, where she brought cases defending the rights of LGBTQI Southerners, including trans prisoners' rights activist Ashley Diamond. She also served as a trial attorney at the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, where she litigated employment discrimination cases and secured a $5.1 million jury verdict on behalf of workers who were subjected to religious harassment. Chinyere is a William J. Fulbright Scholar and a graduate of Yale University and Columbia Law School, where she was an Alexander Hamilton Scholar and served as editor in chief of the Journal of Gender and Law. This is as appropriate a moment as any to note that both Chinyere and Sergio were students during the 2009-2010 academic year in my course in law and sexuality. And one of the wonderful things about doing the work that those of us who are academic lawyers do is watching our students become our teachers. And I have learned more from these two folks in the 8.5, 9 years since they graduated than I'm sure they ever learned from me. So it's a real honor for me to have Sergio and Chinyere on the panel together. Our third speaker is Chase Strangio. Chase is a staff attorney with the ACLU's LGBT and HIV project. Chase's work includes impact litigation as well as legislative and administrative advocacy on behalf of LGBTQ people and people living with HIV across the United States. Chase's particular expertise has to do with the treatment of transgender and gender nonconforming people in police custody, jails, prisons, and other forms of and institutions of detention. Prior to joining the ACLU, Chase was an Equal Justice Works Fellow and Director of Prisoner Justice Initiatives at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, one of our most important community based non governmental advocacy groups. And there, Chase represented transgender and gender nonconforming individuals in confinement settings. In 2012, Chase founded the Lorena Borjas Community Fund, which is an organization whose mission is to provide direct bail and bond assistance to LGBTQ immigrants in criminal and immigration cases. Chase is a graduate of Northeastern University School of Law and of Grinnell College. So these folks are going to be talking about their particular location professionally and institutionally as attorneys and about the uses and limits both of a legal framework for understanding issues of transgender violence and for addressing through advocacy and activism issues of transgender violence. So we will begin with Sergio.
Thank you so much, Professor Kendall and Catherine, for the invitation. It's a big honor for me to be here. 9 years ago, I was sitting next to Chinyere in the law school, main building, attending Professor Kendall's seminar on law and sexuality. And now I'm here as a guest speaker in this awesome workshop. So for me, it's a huge honor. I guess I was invited because I've been advocating human rights causes in Brazil for almost 25 years already, as a prosecutor and prior as a public defender. Currently, I coordinate the working group on sexual and reproductive rights of the Federal Ombudsman Office in Brasilia, and also I'm a Federal Ombudsman for the state of Rio de Janeiro. My office has published this booklet that I distributed to you guys today. Unfortunately, it's in Portuguese, but hope you have a, maybe you can have a glimpse of what have we been doing. It's important to say that the prosecution service in Brazil then deals not only with criminal law cases, but also with civil cases aiming at defending and promoting fundamental rights from the perspective of the collectiveness. Therefore, the prosecutors in Brazil can start collective lawsuits, settle agreements, and issue recommendations in order to enforce the rule of law in matter of civil, economic, social, and cultural rights. That said, I would start by saying that in recent years, progress in the state recognition of transgender people's rights has occurred in Brazil. To some extent, administrative regulations and judicial decisions have acknowledged their right to change both their assigned name and gender in official documents, as well as the right to a healthcare system that provides attention to their specific needs. Nevertheless, Brazil also presents one of the highest numbers of murders and assaults against LGBTs in Western countries. Besides, the future of LGBTs' rights is in a serious threat after the election of Jair Bolsonaro as president of Brazil. My presentation today is divided into three parts. First, I describe the present situation of the acknowledged rights, civil, political, economic, and social rights in our legal system. Then I share the available data on violence and discrimination against transgender people in Brazil. And finally, I finish pointing out some challenges to address the issue. Well, let me start by the first topic, acknowledged rights. Only recently, rights of transgender people have been acknowledged by the Brazilian legal system. That happens mostly due to judicial decisions and administrative ordinances rather than by laws approved by the National Congress. In fact, since the 1988 Constitution, the so-called Bancada da Bíblia, Bible Caucus, has been successfully bearing initiatives in favor of LGBTs. So far, the landmark civil rights for transgender civil rights in Brazil is the March 2018 Supreme Federal Court decision in a constitutional lawsuit filed by my office, the General Prosecution Office. The court took a considerable step forward by deciding that people can change their given names and assign genders at the registry office without having to undergo a surgery or filing a lawsuit, and regardless medical opinions. The decision was delivered 3 months after the Inter-American Court of Human Rights Advisory Opinion, OC 24, of November 2017, according to which state members of the American Convention on Human Rights have the obligation to permit transgender individuals to change their name and gender on identity documents. Therefore, from the Supreme Federal Court decision on, the modification of one's given name and assigned gender in the civil registry depends exclusively on the will of the person expressed to a public notary. Undoubtedly, it's a great progress because before the decision, administrative ordinances only allowed transgender people use their social names in healthcare services, federal offices, and schools. Changing the assigned gender in official documents, however, required before at least a medical diagnosis of gender identity disorder, followed by a petition filed before a local court. The outcome was uncertain given the lack of legislation on the issue. Social and economic rights of transgender people, on the other hand, are far less advanced. Healthcare has been a minor exception to the rule of discrimination, extreme vulnerability, and violence experienced by transgender individuals. In fact, since 2008, university hospitals located in the states of São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Rio Grande do Sul, Goiás, Espírito Santo, and Pernambuco have provided sex reassignment surgeries, but the service is insufficient to meet the demand. In the state of São Paulo, for instance, only 4 surgeries have been monthly performed, and slots are fully booked for the next 2 years. Here, there's a map that we can find. You guys can see the location of the healthcare centers specified in transgender health. These purple are the hospitals, and the pink is the secondary ambulatory care centers. So as you can see, most of the centers are located in the south and southeast part of Brazil, and therefore, like transgender people from other states must travel like to another state in order to get the healthcare assistance. This is another. This is a chart showing the increasing number of consultations, hormone replacement therapy. As you can see, like in 2018, almost 10,000 consultations were performed, and so there's a big increase considering the 2008 number of only 91 cases of consultations. This is another chart showing that the number of surgeries is still low. Only 73 surgeries were performed last year, so it's not sufficient to meet the demand, as I said. In 2013, as I said, the National Healthcare Policy for transgender people was expanded to include hormone replacement therapy as well as preventative health care. A regulation by the Ministry of Health provides federal funding for the states that meet the qualifications required by the ordinance. Thanks to this policy, other states in Brazil have provided primary and ambulatory care in public clinics, although with limited resources. My office has been conducting an inquiry on this issue. Let me move to another aspect of the knowledge rights, that is the political rights. First, I'd like to say that there's a remarkable empowerment of social movement in the last 15 years. We noticed that. And as a result of this, of the empowerment of social movement, in the last election, 53 transgender candidates ran, either for federal or states legislatures, and 3 of them were elected for legislatures in the states of São Paulo and Pernambuco. There is Érica Malunguinho, Érica Hilton, and Robionce Lima. These 3 ladies below the slide. Despite the advances reported in the previous topic, transgender people remain one of the most discriminated and subordinated groups in Brazilian society. In fact, according to a 2016 report delivered by the Trans Murder Monitoring Project, it's a worldwide project, among 66 countries, Brazil has the highest absolute numbers of murders of transgender people. Between 2008 and 2016, 868 cases of murder of transgender individuals were informed. Reports of murder in Brazil have consistently been so high that the country accounts for almost 40% of all reported murders worldwide since 2008, states the documents of this project, Trans Murder Monitoring Project. I would like to stress the fact that most of cases of homicide were committed in Latin American countries. Maybe, perhaps, this is a result of the macho culture or sexism, and that it's widespread in the continent. However, so far, no official data on violence against transgender individuals have been collected by law enforcement agencies in Brazil. In fact, there is no specific field in crime report forms to communicate the gender identity of the victim or occasional hate-motivated violence towards LGBTs. I don't know if you guys have this space in the forms for putting the identity, the gender identity of the victim. the flaw obviously hinders the development of public policies aiming to protect LGBTs against insults and physical violence. In order to quantify and report murder cases of transgender individuals, a network of transgender organizations has been set. The network produces an annual report and is responsible for monitoring cases of murder reported by the media in a project called Observatório da Violência. According to the 2017 report, 179 transgender individuals were killed in Brazil, 169 trans women and transvestites, and 10 trans men. I'd like to make a brief remark on this word, transvestites, because like I know that here is not common, the use of this word, at least among the movement, but in Brazil is a matter of identity, a self-identification of these people. I mean, for them, it's important to stress the fact that they are not trans people; they are transvestites. It's a different and a totally accepted identity inside the movement. So that's why I use this word transvestite, because it's the identity that's assumed as a identity for many people. And 10 trans men are killed in 2017. The annual increase of the cases of murder is shown on this chart. This is a chart produced by this National Association of Transvestites and Transsexuals, ANTRA. The report mentions that in 80% of the cases, victims were Black. It also reveals an increase of 15% of reported cases of homicide compared to 2016. The age of the victims is shown on this chart. As you can see, the 68% of the victims were between 16 and 29 years old. In the next slides, you may see some faces of the victims who got murdered. This is Dandara. She was brutally killed in Ceará in 2018. This is Mateusa. She was a visual art student in the State University of Rio de Janeiro. She was killed by drug dealers in a favela in Rio de Janeiro last year. And this was the most recent case, the case of Kelly da Silva. She was 35 years old, and she was brutally killed last Monday in Campinas. And the murderer ripped out her heart and put a image of a scent on top of the body. So it's really awful. Physical violence is intimately related to the condition of subordination experienced by transvestites and transsexuals. The narrative of many transgender individuals include a past of discrimination by the family, bullying at school followed by a dropout, an abyss to access the formal labor market, and for those who have to work as sex workers, a permanent situation of harassment, violence, and extortion by the police. Actually, not many transgender people have survived after the age of 30 years old in Brazil. As the report states, the National Association report states, it is estimated that 13 years old is the average age of transvestites and transsexuals are expelled from their own homes by their parents, and that only 0.02% of them enter higher education. 72% don't have a high school degree, and 56% have not attended the elementary school. 70% of the murders were committed against sex workers, and 55% of them happened on the street. These articles were published in December, so all these 4 cases are related to December 2018. As the report of the association said, in this scenario, the overwhelming majority of the victims who have been pushed into prostitution find themselves in a situation of great social vulnerability and exposed to all kinds of physical and psychological aggressions. Another phase of violence and discrimination is censorship. This is a case of Renata Carvalho. She plays she performs in a play called The Gospel According to Jesus, Queen of Mary. And this play was censored like several times in Brazil, in several states, either by judicial decisions or by the local administration. So this is another phase of violence and discrimination. people were offended because like the play is about like what would be if Jesus was a transvestite or a transgender person. So that's the religious groups were very offended because of this play. Education is another complicated field for LGBT children and youth. As it happens in other countries, Brazilian LGBT students face a hostile school environment. In recent years, initiatives to fight against school bullying and discrimination in schools have been facing a strong backlash from conservative religious groups who eventually came to power with Jair Bolsonaro. A powerful religious caucus at the National Congress, as I said, was elected as well. In fact, Bolsonaro himself spent a greater part of the electoral campaign stating that he would fight against gender ideology, which is, according to him, spread in schools over the country and represents a threat for family values. Initiatives on controlling and censoring the teaching of sex education and gender equality have been undertaken in barely all Brazilian states. A strong chilling effect has already been felt among teachers who have avoided subjects related to sexual orientation and gender identity in their classes. That leads me to the third topic, which is advocating for LGBT rights under Bolsonaro's administration. Please allow me to introduce Ms. Damaris Alves. She is the new Minister of Family, Women. This is the new ministry that was created by Bolsonaro. Minister of Family, Women and Human Rights. I'd like to show a brief video. Attention. It's a new age in Brazil. Boys wear blue, girls wear pink. Boys wear blue and girls wear pink. This is the new Minister of Human Rights in Brazil. It's ridiculous. Sorry, I feel so ashamed because of that. Yeah. These are some quotations coming from this minister. No ideological indoctrination in classrooms. We will respect the biological identity of the children. Girls are princesses, boys are princes. And this is a picture of a protest against Judith Butler in São Paulo. You can see her picture there. And the protesters burnt a figure of Judith Butler, effigy of Judith Butler, and they are saying that she was a witch, she's a witch, and she's pro killing children because she's pro abortion and so on and so forth. So this is the context that we've been dealing with in Brazil. So far, after 20 days, only 20 days after the Bolsonaro came to power, a booklet on healthcare of transgender men was removed from the Ministry of Health website. And what's the scenario? So we are expecting cuts in healthcare and education policies and the budget. We are expecting censorship in schools and educational resources published by the federal government, the so-called fight against gender ideology. And we are expecting an increase of physical violence against LGBTs. That's what we're expecting. And so what are the limits of legal advocacy in this context, in this scenario? First of all, it's important to remark there is a lack of federal anti-discrimination laws protecting LGBTs, and therefore we have to relying on judicial decisions, and that's a problem because there are limits, of course, for judicial decisions to deal with public policies and budget cuts. And another important issue is to what extent can legal advocacy fight against to move forward the problem of cultural change. That's another limit for legal advocacy, as I think. And I finished by raising some questions for the debate. So first, can social movement count on institutions or only on people in them? To what extent will institutions such as the judiciary, public universities, schools, and the healthcare administration be able to resist the current threats of denial of rights? Secondly, how can one deepen the alliances among different subalternized groups, both at the domestic level and the global level? And specifically regarding the legal field, is legal reasoning grounded on equality as a rational principle better than a pragmatic strategy based on narratives of discrimination? And what are the limits of legal system regarding social, cultural, and political change? As a conclusion, I would like to say that the issues faced by trans people in Brazil are probably similar to those experienced by transgender people in other Latin American countries, in which cultural depreciation and unequal distribution of the resources and wealth are imbricated. The election of Jair Bolsonaro has brought a pessimistic scenario under which less rights and more violence are expected. The strength to resist the authoritarian wave that has arrived will define the road Brazil will go down in the next years. Thank you very much.
So next we'll hear, I think okay, Chinyere and Chase.
So, hello everyone. I'm Chinyere Ezie. Very glad to be here and glad to be here with Chase as well. I'm going to turn his mic on. And I think that if you saw an inadvertent smile when Sergio was speaking, I think it sort of goes to the adage of you laugh to keep from crying. And I think that what I was struck by is how all of the problems that we are working on in our individual contexts and countries have such a global resonance, and how, you know, the questions that you parted with are ones that I think LGBT and, specifically trans rights activists are really grappling with, right? Which is sort of, what is the source of rights? What produces rights? Is it the courts? Is it the courts if Kavanaugh and Gorsuch are on it, and have are the court of final review? The idea that Trump gets elected here, and rather than the world see it as a historic mistake, they also clamor to get their own fascists in office, and that we're sort of in this era where minority rights and minority bodies and lives and just the mere existence of trans people is viewed as a threat of sort of existential significance to to the people that don't love us, and the people that benefit from hegemony and benefit from patriarchy and benefit from white male privilege, such that it's this sort of a coordinated campaign to stamp it out or to inflame public sentiment against the LGBT community more broadly by using trans bodies as expendable subjects, as detestable subjects. And so, I come to this conversation not necessarily as optimistic about the road that we're headed down. And I feel as though, what comes to mind is sort of all of the ways that the trans community is being subjected to violence at this moment, and how that violence is state violence, how that violence is interpersonal violence, how there's a societal component where it's almost kind of being reified and reaffirmed, and it's not, should we protect trans women, but well, why are they tricking us, and why, and sort of, and who told them to do that, and why are they, trying to form intimate relationships, sort of all these conditions to be able to exist. And and how all of that violence feels like it serves, at least one master, and that's sort of the preservation of a social stratification, a social hierarchy, that kind of accepts colonialism as the source of civilization, that accepts sort of Judeo-Christianity as a meaningful framework to order our lives, and that accepts that, you know, there are men and there are women, and that is how we reproduce our societies, and that's how we build families, and that there's, you know, that not only is there binary, there can't be any movement between the categories, and how that sort of just serves a natural order that has bestowed, you know, a very many some sense of order, some sense of maybe even personal identity, you know, such that so many different actors have a stake in whether people get to call themselves MX or people get to use they them pronouns. You know, it's as if any non-binary genders or any, you know, transgender identities threaten my gender, you know, threaten my heterosexuality, threaten my sense of family and my sense of place in the world. And so I think that there is, you know, flailing, like people are flailing their fists and striking out, and people's lives are being destroyed and decimated in the process.
Is this working? Yeah. Okay. So, hi everyone. My name is Chase. I'm a lawyer here, based in New York at the ACLU. And yeah, Chinyere asked me to come join the conversation. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm sort of situating this in my thinking around sort of what it means to be a U.S. based lawyer within the U.S. system of law, sort of contending with the idea of violence within a structure that is itself inherently violent, which is our system of law, that we then export around the world. And so one of the things I'm always struck by is that as a lawyer, our turn towards the law always inevitably produces the very harms that we're fighting against. And I'm sort of hearing that from both of you, and this idea that, you know, well, what does it mean to sort of look to systems of equality, or to look to systems that are sort of designed to maintain anti-Blackness globally, designed to maintain the colonial structures that have been sort of the defining characteristics of the U.S. legal system at a minimum, but much of the European system as well. And so I was just sort of struck by that, and I was thinking, I just got back. I was in November. I was in Buenos Aires working with trans leaders from around the world, sort of anticipating the change in government in parts of Europe and in Brazil, and sort of what does it look like to sort of contend with this notion of gender ideology that we're seeing around the world, this idea that that we can sort of control this and weaponize this notion of science and biology for the purposes of maintaining these distinct binary categories of gender, for the purpose of really maintaining existing power as we know it. And was just struck how this really is a global movement, to sort of weaponize the idea of gender, and to sort of create this idea of biological scientific truths that are then sort of imposed on people for the purpose of maintaining and regulating their bodily autonomy, reproductive capacity, and then are also used in the service of state building. So I think about, well, what does it mean to have the government classifying gender? What are the purposes behind it? And, you know, as we are sitting here, you know, two things are happening, or that I noticed happening this morning. One, there was reports about Japan, courts in Japan upholding the idea that changes of gender have to be tied to forced sterilization. And so what does it mean that the government is so invested in the sterilization, in sort of connecting reproductive capacity to what it means to have a gender, and then controlling that. And then also here in New York City, Governor Cuomo is signing at the LGBT Center the hate crimes and gender identity protection law, gender. And so I was thinking about both those things as sort of perfect examples of the inherent limitations of the law as a response to violence. So when it comes to the law as a response to violence in sort of the U.S., all I can think about is our use of the criminal legal system as the site for contending with interpersonal violence by expanding state violence. So you have in New York, we can't even conceptualize formal equality, separate and apart from whether it has much utility on its own. But, we sort of tie formal equality to the expansion of punitive systems. So, you have the state enhancing its power to incarcerate people in the service of protecting, trans bodies in this case. And of course, I can't. It's so closely tied to me to sort of this idea of, the Israeli flag as being sort of so using different governments and sort of how the U.S. aligns itself with Israel in the context of claiming some alliance over the protection of trans and LGBTQI people in Israel in the service of sort of pinkwashing and so that seems inextricable from sort of Jeff Sessions being the first AG to prosecute under the federal hate crimes law an anti-trans crime. So it's like we are sort of connecting our state building project with the idea that we're using our governments to rectify this idea of anti-trans violence, when in fact what we're doing is just building the same punitive systems that are exerting the same problematic sets of norms, but saying that we're doing it in some sort of remedial capacity. And then that, also strikes me as inextricable from the notion that the government has some role to play in classifying, what is a man and what is a woman, and sort of what are the terms under which you can move between those categories, and then what happens to bodies that are situated outside of them, and sort of how we exact violence in our legal frameworks, both the sort of more the ones that are characterized as being about rectifying past harms, whether that's equality laws, hate crimes laws, public assistance laws, but really those also have connected to them very much this agenda of codifying and reinforcing notions of gender that themselves are very violent and exclusionary, and sort of build this idea that allows things like quote unquote biological sex to be weaponized for the purposes of excluding people and denying them access to sort of any meaningful health outcome and bodily autonomy. And so as a lawyer, I'm constantly struck by, and I'm not an academic at all. I'm just like a everyday practicing lawyer who is sort of aware that my job reinforces these systems that are, but then without some engagement, what do we do when we are inherently reinforcing the systems, but we know that there are sort of micro changes that maybe we can make along the way to increase people's opportunities to survive under them. And so like, how do we draw the lines? Where are the lines? Is the lines no hate crimes? Is the lines, no formal equality? Is it just that we never engage with the system? Because I've already made a decision that that's not what I'm doing, because I'm a practicing lawyer. I am always already engaging in it. So, and frankly, so are all of you, even if you're not. And so what does it mean to sort of then both try to stand outside of it and sort of recognize the harms, but make the choices about when and how we're going to be complicit or participate in the production of those harms, and whether it's through the creation of gendered subjects by just creating the narrative and turning towards the state, or it's through sort of actively reinforcing things like the criminal legal system by being seeking some actual tangible benefit for an actual concrete client. So I think we have a real set of sort of challenges to contend with as lawyers, as thinkers, as individuals who are sort of engaging with our government on both the sort of micro administrative level every day, and then sort of as legislative in the legislative processes and then in sort of electoral engagement as well. And I see obviously there's this rise of the gender ideology discourse around the world, coinciding with the rise of far-right extremist governments around the world, and obviously those two things are connected. I think we're not necessarily making those connections in the U.S. because we don't often think outside of our U.S. context to the global implications of what we're contending with. But I see it every day in state legislatures here and in our reform efforts, and see us being very much complicit in these sort of global far-right movements. And watching people die as a result of both the discursive terrain that we've agreed upon and the sort of tangible policy outcomes that are flowing from it.
And I think that, Chase has really framed, a real dilemma for, the more progressive segments of the trans advocacy movement, which is why the state, why courts? And I think the answer, probably, maybe everyone who was posed it would have to reflect and come up with something different. But I think, for me at least, it's because there's so much evidence that, the beloved community that, civil rights leaders of yore talked about, where, we would sort of all uphold the social contract, because of a sense of kind of radical empathy or radical sort of humanness. It's never manifested, right? We as individuals, like I as an EOC lawyer was, motivated to join that agency because I realized that trans folks, and especially trans women of color, were being incarcerated at incredible rates. Once they were incarcerated, they were being brutalized at horrifying rates and in horrifying ways. But, you know, the trigger for all of that, the trigger for their criminal justice involvement, was that when they walked into Walmart or walked into CVS and applied for jobs in their southern towns, they were being told, oh, what is that gender marker on your license? Or like, what's that Adam's apple? Whatever. They're basically being, you know, profiled, clocked, and, turned away when people realize they were trans. And so what do you do when you need to eat and no one will hire you? So I tried to start at the source, right? And that was me not only looking to the state, it was me joining the state, it was me becoming the state and trying to effectuate a form of change. But the thing is, you see these limits, but you see, for me, I guess what I'm left with is just this radical disappointment in us as humans, and how the dog whistles always work, right? How, high level conservative strategists can really, sit in a room and write memos and say, here's how we respond to the marriage equality movement. We attack trans people. Let's start in Houston. And it works. It works every damn time, It's like, trans panic still works. It's still effective. You can still count on it, right? And I'm disappointed in us. I'm disappointed in us for accepting that there's something abnormal, something disruptive in a way that's not positive about sort of gender non-normativity, and how we've accepted that it's a recent perversion, when if you look at any pre-colonial histories, you see we've always been trans. We've always been, you know, genderqueer, and it's been celebrated. It was celebrated in sub-Saharan Africa, right? It was thought to be divine. It was, to be, non-binary specifically, to be intersex. These things were celebrated, and then, you know, and then there were these confrontations, and there were these cultures were absorbed, by these colonial powers who rewrote all these narratives, right? It's such that when I see my Nigerian relatives, I'm always waiting for them to say, you're queer, that's so Western, when it's like, no, 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 it's not. You can't cite Catholicism and say that, this is not African because of the Bible, when y'all didn't have that before they came with their swords and their slave ships, right? And so just the fact that we've kind of lost ourselves so completely in someone else's story is really painful. And I think there's a final form of violence that is exacted on trans people by the state and by, you know, by the non-beloved community. And that is sort of, you know, the violence of sort of having to explain yourself, right? And having to sort of put your body up for inspection, right? And having to have that doctor's letter, because we haven't had a decision like the one in Brazil that says, you know, people have a right to radical bodily autonomy, right? And can be whatever gender they want to be and can present and get the papers they need and don't need to sort of have some attestation from some third party gatekeeper that, you know, they have had the procedure or they've taken the steps or they've done the treatment, you know, such that I even know people who are non-binary who've had to basically cop to, you know, I've always been in the wrong body and I've always, you know, and I've known that I wanted to play with trucks when I was a kid, when all they really want is to stop the dysphoria that comes from having breasts, you know, but they have to sort of tell someone else's story to get medical treatment, because saying I would feel better if I didn't have breasts is not a valid way to access care, right? And so, as for to kind of circle back to something Kendall Thomas said, and I will be the first to say I was very flattered to think that I have taught him anything. I tend to think of myself just as like an internet loudmouth and like the angry black girl at your service. But one of the people who's taught me a lot is my little sister, who is like, you know, when we were little, would kind of tease me about how I didn't know how to walk in high heels, and I, you know, only carried like Vaseline in my messenger bag, and, you know, not like lipstick in a purse, but has grown to be someone who, without any deep feminist exposure or training, just gets queer and trans lives. And she has a podcast that I was listening to on the way over, and it inspired me to want to share it with you. Her name is Kalechi, and the podcast is called Cake and Kombucha. You can subscribe to it on iTunes, and there are a couple times I've made appearances and ranted about things. But she decided on her own, without any consultation of her, you know, queer, trans advocate, lawyer sibling, that she was outraged about the trans military ban, not because she, you know, fails to see how military, you know, the military industrial complex, you know, exacts violence, right? And kind of expects violence from the people who are ennobled by it, but because, you know, as a black woman, she understood what it's like to be named in the law in the wrong way, right? To be told, and you know, citizen, do not have rights, right? And so her reaction was, how is it in 2019 we can disenfranchise people and have it in a law and have that upheld? Like, how do we do that? You know, as a black woman, she was upset about that. And she shared this that I think, again, goes to sort of the context is she's talking about how baffling it is that trans people have to, again, present their bodies for inspection and say, you know, are you real? Did you have the surgery? You have to declare and be like, I'm not a girl like you. I'm not a boy like you know, on the first date, or else you are a deserving target of violence. It's that kind of societal narrative. And this is what she came up with.
Like tricking people. And there's so much talk about like, you got to tell people who you are up front. No, if you come grab my booty, do I have to turn around and be like, hey, you know, when I take my pants off, it might not be perched as high, you know, it's just sitting good in these jeans. So I just want to let you know, like, just so you know everything. Or like, you know, sometimes I get a Brazilian wax, but today I got a French wax. And I just have a landing strip on my poom poom now. I don't know if that kind of grooming pattern is okay for you. Hey, before you talk to me any further, I want you to know that I have hair clips in. Let me take them out right now, because you told me you found me beautiful and I know I owe you an explanation. No, that doesn't happen. Like, stop it. Approach who you want, love who you want. And this kind of fear we're fomenting, which leads back to the fear of, you know, of certain sexualities being wrong. It's just a big circle, but it's leading to people literally getting murdered and, you know, maligning an entire group of people by saying that they can't serve in the military. How are they going to feel protected?
And again, I'm grateful for having teachers in all different places.
And we'll collect some questions. I think we have one extra mic. or no, we don't have one extra mic today. Is there a mic? We can pass this around. I thought I might start actually while folks are thinking about what they'd like to ask or comments they'd like to make with the critique that I'm hearing from all three of you, which riffing off the volume of some years ago that Janet Halley and Wendy Brown edited, Left Legalism, I'll call trans legalism, right? Because in each of your remarks, I'm hearing a critique of trans legalism. Why the state? Why courts? And each of you is, even the two of you who currently work for non-governmental organizations, you are state agents, right? Who are relying on state institutions to do the work of, if not trying to achieve trans justice, to minimize trans injustice. And so as you were talking, the image that came to me as a way of trying to frame advocacy against trans violence by lawyers is you're really working with what in the public health context is called a harm reduction model, right? Because both the problem and the remedy involve violence, right? And that's a paradox, right? How do you use violence or appeal to violence to address violence? And it occurs to me that, maybe one way to think of this is to try to find a language that's not the language of law that can help us conceptualize what forms of advocacy and activism or how forms of advocacy and activism might understand conceptually the practical work that they're doing, right? So this harm reduction idea occurs to me as one possibility. That's one response to the problem of trans legalism. And the second response to the problem of trans legalism, which I think, Chinyere, in talking about your sister's podcast, came home quite vividly to me, and in the example that you offered of the artist whose work was censored, is to view the project of seeking trans justice generally and addressing the injustice of trans violence in particular through cultural work, right? And the late, great Afro-British cultural theorist Stuart Hall once wrote that we need to think about the ways in which politics is a field which has to do with how people imagine themselves, right? And the right wing projects that you're describing are very much tapped into this cultural work of inviting people to imagine themselves in ways that require and normalize violence against trans people, right? And so what do you see as the work that lawyers can do to empower the leadership of trans justice movements, with respect to this question of harm reduction, and B, with respect to this question of cultural rights that can open up and enlarge our imagination, both with respect to how we think about gender, but also, and this goes to the conversation that Ezie and I were having at dinner last night about rights, right? Because you are rights skeptics who nonetheless have to mobilize the language of rights. Is there a cultural language of rights that is larger than and politically more effective than the legal language of rights, which, when combined with this strategy of harm reduction, might help us think through this impasse that that all three of you from different locations have called our attention to. Is that
If Sergio will be generous and Chase as well, I'd like to take the first stab at. I don't know if I'm answering your question or just articulating that that your questions are complex enough that maybe what I feel most certain of is what the cultural work doesn't look like or shouldn't look like, right? I think the cultural work or claims of cultural rights cannot be premised on the bodies of the most assimilated or assimilatable, right? And I think that's actually something that we, as a trans legal movement, continue to get wrong. I think there's still, I mean, you've yet to see a case about where do I get to pee at school that's involved a non-binary person, right? You're never going to see that case, as far as I know. And I don't know, whether winning the right for someone like Gavin Grimm, who Chase has been a fierce advocate for, or a trans girl somewhere who's binary. I don't know if that gets rights for non-binary people, right? I don't know what, as a trans legal movement, we're doing for non-binary people and why. I think it's because the stories that have been easiest to tell are the ones we've been telling. And those are, I'm just like you, I'm just a boy, I'm just a girl. We're picking people who look like everyone else, right? Who aren't gender fluid, right? And I think that we might very well be finding ourselves soon in the exact place that we were about 10 years ago when I was still here at law school, where we knew to be critical of, right? Which is that the LGBT movement was leaving all trans people behind, right? They were literally going to support the passage of employment discrimination bill that had no reference to gender identity protections. And we knew at that time the danger of hoping that the revolving door will keep swinging back, right? And that you can just pick up more people on the next pass. And, trans folks, y'all will get your rights just in a little while. We'll come back for you, don't worry. We knew that didn't work. Yet, I think that we are making non-binary people expendable. I think we're making people who aren't cis-passing lie in really murky territory. And I think that, what I'm curious about is what power can be wielded by trying to really start a conversation about how gender is assigned for everyone, right? Whether you might feel very strongly about your gender, but should it be something that the state is regulating? If you realize how intersex folks are just being slapped into a category, without any consent or consultation, typically when these surgeries are being performed in childhood. I mean, when trans folks sort of break the mold, I mean, can you really feel certain that gender is just male or female and it's clean and clear and, not messy, and even if that's your belief, how would you feel if the state looked at you at birth and said, okay, you're black, you're white, you're, I don't know, other, and just slapped on your birth certificate, right? We would feel that's impossible. We would realize that the state has no business regulating such a personal aspect of identity, even if it's real, even if I'm a black woman, politically, socially, when I go to the makeup counter and try to figure out my foundation, I still don't need the state telling me who I am. And why do we accept that treatment for gender?
I guess quickly. I mean, so I will confess that my thinking is very much informed by both Janet Halley and Wendy Brown, and it's interesting because I also think yes, we're all agents of the state. I don't think that's specific to being a lawyer that's practicing, certainly. Well, I mean, I guess certainly. I think if you're teaching at a law school, you're an agent of the state. You're doing the work of the state. You're working in an institution that you're working in such a way where the tax structure of your institution, your pay, your discourse is controlled by the state. Your ability to think outside of what you think of as the system is also subject to the whims of the government and the way in which the institution is situated and defined by the government. And that we're all engaging in the administrative state, certainly all the time, to the extent we exist and buy food and take public transportation. And I think we're at least in relation to the state, and I think also agents of the state, certainly if we've gone to law school and are sort of teaching in sort of a legal discursive structure. But I guess I've been as a practical matter, what does it mean to? I don't think there's. I think of rights as a distinctly legal construction. I don't know that I think there's legal rights and other rights. I think the law would define both the legal rights and the extra legal rights. But I guess from my perspective, what I've been thinking about and actually talking to organizers from other countries, and thinking more about the role of the lawyer as being as sort of in the harm reduction model, I would like to think of us more as looking at, well, what are the types of sort of survival structures that people are trying to form that the state would try to encroach on, and what is our potential role in protecting that? So that might look at sort of preventing the criminalization of organizing, or protecting sort of what would be seen as criminalized ways of sharing food or housing, or producing art, or disrupting the enforcement of the criminal legal system and the immigration enforcement system. And then the lawyer could be the intermediary, the sort of way of observing how the state would seek to increase surveillance and criminalization of extra legal ways of surviving. So whether that's to protect artists, to protect organizers, to understand and try to observe, to sit by, to be the spook who sits by the door and watch how is the state responding to the means of survival that people are creating, and what can we do to both make that apparent and disrupt it, rather than looking at, well, what is our narrative turn to the state so that we're cognizable legal subjects? Instead, say, what is the state doing to prevent our survival, and how can we disrupt that process, rather than turn to it and ask to be seen?
I would say that, as Chase stated earlier, our dilemma that we live as lawyers, because as lawyers we are already part of the system or engaged in the system, but on the other hand, we are compromised with to change the system. So to what extent it's possible to use the legal system to fight against the system itself of discrimination? I would say that I would like to stress the fact that legal advocacy is not only, maybe responding to your question, not only a matter of change the legal system itself, but also is part of a more large strategy of cultural fight or cultural change. So we are not only aiming at achieve or having a decision in legal terms, but when we start a lawsuit and when we start a collective lawsuit or individual lawsuit, we are maybe aiming to bring to the table the issue, not necessarily whether or not we get a decision, a positive decision for us, but just like bring to the table this new possibility that the legal advocacy brings to us. That
so there's this we could say there's like an expressive function over and above the specific pragmatic instrumental goal of getting the client the health care she needs, or getting the client in a place within the detention facility where he can be safe. And that expressive function is something that you're always going to want to be conscious of as a lawyer, in terms of the choices that you make, the specific technical choices that you make with respect to legal strategy. Is that what you're saying?
Definitely, yes. Let's think about like a Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus Board of Education is not a matter of only a matter of changing the legal system itself. It's a more broad idea that brings this decision brings that meaning that there's a it brought a cultural change for the United States. So that maybe that's what we're aiming at, fighting for LGBT rights in Brazil. Not only getting aiming at having a good decision, but also as I said, bringing to the table.
Mm-hmm.
And this is strategies for me. It's really clear. I mean, I don't have the idea that we're gonna change everything by starting a lawsuit or but even so, I think it's important when you uh, uh, start this lawsuit and then when you issue a recommendation on LGBT rights, uh, there's a small space for cultural change, I would say.
Mm-hmm. We'll open it up.
Here, you can have this.
Hello. Thank you all so much for your comments and for what you shared. I wondered if Chinyere and Chase, you could elaborate a little bit more on your thoughts about the trans military ban. And I know some trans organizations have specifically said because we see the military as an apparatus of empire, we are not fighting for trans inclusion. And other trans organizations have said we see this as an issue of equal access. And I wondered if you could inform us about how you think about that question.
Whoa, that's alarming. I am litigating a trans military ban case. I don't know how one would say, I'm going to participate in legal inclusion projects but draw the line here. I just don't think that's a particularly coherent line. Like, oh, okay, you can have like general employment protections and that's not building. I mean, because once you're dealing with the governmental structures of the law, I don't see how you're sort of outside the apparatus of the military industrial complex. I just don't know that there's a coherent line once you're doing governmental inclusion projects generally. And actually, so I could see drawing the line as I will not do legal inclusion work because I think it inherently requires us to turn to the state in such a way that we're building the state. I did not. So I feel concerned about my role in the legal system every day, but it's not because of my work on the trans military ban. I guess I'll say that. And I definitely have concerns about the U.S. military as a general matter. But the way in which the ban was structured, it's to my mind inextricable from other sort of legal ways of sort of situating trans bodies as being sort of outside the legal protection as a general matter. So saying, okay, well, we can't provide health care to people who are in the military because this health care is disruptive and costly. That line was going to be, letting that go is letting it go for all governmental programs. And so if we're doing legal inclusion work, then we're doing legal inclusion work. And that's, to me, whether it's the military or a state employee insurance program, that it's you sort of you're compromised once you're in. But to me, the line wasn't at the military, and so I also think our military is a very coercive actor in terms of the distribution of benefits to individuals in the United States, whether it's education benefits, immigration benefits, financial benefits, long-term financial security for people who are in. It didn't seem like the project I was willing to abandon after already deciding that I was fine with formal equality in our constitutional structures as a general matter. So I feel compromised every day, but I don't lose extra sleep over that one.
And I think to answer your question in a slightly different way, I don't think that the dueling views, that it's necessarily a case where one is right and one is wrong, right? I think it's about sort of how you allocate resources and how you think about resources. And I think resources are sort of money, can be money, resources can be, your physical body, a body in labor, right? It can be your time. And if I had the ability to choose the next case I would bring and whether it's going to be to challenge the military ban or something else, I might, that's an individual choice, right? And I don't think there'd be a wrong I don't think there'd be a wrong decision. I think the work needs to be done. I guess the question is it, if you don't do it, will it be done by someone else? And if the answer is no, then that might switch the pendulum for me. That said, I think that the military is an institution that's very complex, but I think participation in the military and exclusion from the military has real economic justice consequences. It has real racial justice consequences. I think in ways that are just even thoroughly complex. The military was where a lot of people that I know went after high school, right? Now, should they have been steered there? Who was steered there? Should guidance counselors have been saying, oh, don't bother applying to college, just do, here's the military recruiter? Probably not, right? I feel really complex about that, or, really dismayed in a lot of ways about who gets pushed into the military and who doesn't. But I still think it's something that produces, has a social reproduction function, right? It's how certain people become middle class, and you know whether we need to kind of blow up our whole economic system and rebuild it is like an open question, But I think it's still, if this is a way that some people who don't have other forms of access, get to have a house and get to have a roof over their head and get to have a paycheck, I'm not sure I'm going to say, trans people need not apply.
I also don't think that I don't know of any organization that does legal work in the United States that took a position that that this was not something that should be opposed. I think there are individuals who did. There are particularly academic individuals who did. But I don't know that like Sylvia Rivera Law Project didn't say didn't say this is perfectly okay. Let's to let this stand. And so I do think that there's a real question about who, sort of what happens once you already decide to be a 501c3 nonprofit and do legal work. Sort of what kind of principled lines are you able to draw at that point? And I think that there was a discourse between people who are outside that structure, academic speakers and those who are practitioners, because I think it's just, I think we have to be honest with ourselves about what we're doing. And truthfully, when I was a staff lawyer at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project for a long time, one of the big complicated questions of being in sort of an organization that claimed to be a prison abolitionist organization while at the same time providing direct legal services was, are we being honest about our role in building the state that we want to tear down? And I think that's where, sort of, I think it's just a matter of really situating ourselves honestly as sort of speakers and participants in the system.
First, I'd like to thank all of you for sharing your knowledge with us. I think my question is more specifically to Sergio. Um, so during Bolsonaro's election process, a lot was discussed about, gender ideology in schools and healthcare, everything basically. And you said that, while engaging with the government as a legal servant, that a part of it is just bringing the subject to the table and trying to cause cultural change. Do you think that throughout his election process, a cultural change happened? Do you think that it brought more consciousness to the population, or do you think that it went the other way around?
I think it's the other way around. I mean, during his election, all the right wing conservative people like came out of the closet. So they are all there, like and we are, as I said, we fear that in the next months we're gonna have like an increasing of the violence against transgender people or LGBTs in general. because during the campaign, Bolsonaro was constantly saying that he's LGBT. We should like fight as a gender ideology, and I'm not homophobic, but I rather not having a child as a gay child, and so on. And that's the kind of thing that we. And today, if you want to have a glimpse of the situation, there's an interview of Bolsonaro in the Washington Post. So as you can see, everything is there. And the reporter asked him if he's against LGBT and women's rights, and said, "No, I love women." So that's the answer that Bolsonaro.
All right, thank you very much for your participation in this terrific discussion. We're going to take a break until 1 o'clock, and we'll reconvene then, and in the hope that the room will be a little warmer. We apologize for that, but we've got a great panel that will begin, we hope, as close to 1 o'clock as possible. So we'll see you all in about an hour and 10 minutes. Thank you very much.